Cole said it in Spanish. Low and easy. Certain I would never catch a word of it. And that single sentence is the exact moment my marriage ended. Right there under the chandelier with a glass of bourbon sweating in his hand. He leaned toward Marcus Boone like he was letting him in on something harmless. Something between men. And told him not to worry about my name being anywhere near the company because the paperwork had already been handled quietly. Whatever happened with this deal, win or lose, he wasn't the one who'd end up losing anything. I kept my fork resting against the edge of my plate and didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't give him the reaction 17 years of marriage had trained him to expect from me. Marcus went still in a way that told me he understood exactly how ugly that sentence was, even if he couldn't have translated a single word of it himself, because some tones don't need language to sound wrong. I had spent 4 years working negotiations in rooms full of men who talked exactly like this. Men who assumed a quiet woman was an empty one. Cole had just proven he still believed that after a decade of watching me sit beside him at 100 dinners just like it. I set my glass down slow, smiled the smile I'd used at every one of those 100 dinners, and told him I needed a minute in the ladies' room. He barely looked up, already sliding back into his pitch. Already certain, the woman walking away from that table was still the same one who'd never once thought to listen closely enough to understand him. I used to sit in rooms where men switched languages the second they thought the real conversation was starting. And I could follow every shift, because 4 years in Madrid and 2 more in Mexico City had taught me how power actually sounds when it isn't dressed up in English. I built a career reading risk in a stranger's contract before he'd finished explaining it out loud. Then my mother had a stroke, and Cole sat across from me at our kitchen table and said we were a team, that I'd just handle things for a while. A couple years at most. Until the distillery found its footing and he could carry both of us again. A couple of years turned into 10 without either of us marking the day it happened. He never asked what those years abroad had actually given me. Never once wondered out loud whether the woman managing his household still had opinions worth hearing about supply contracts or investor terms. I watched him build an entire company on instinct and charm, while the instincts I'd spent years sharpening sat untouched in a drawer he didn't know existed. I told myself it was temporary the way you tell yourself a lot of things when leaving feels harder than staying quiet. Cole would mention the bank. Mention Sophie's tuition fund for years to come. Mention how tight things were until the next big account landed. And every time I offered an idea, he'd smile the way you smile at a child who said something sweet but useless. He never asked me to sit in on a single negotiation in 10 years. Not once. Not even the small ones. By the time Marcus Boone's name started coming up at dinner every night, I'd stopped expecting Cole to remember what I used to be capable of. I just didn't know yet how far that forgetting had already gone on paper. In accounts and signatures I hadn't seen, long before either of us ever sat down across from Marcus at that table. Cole spent the first 20 minutes of dinner selling Marcus Boone on numbers he'd rehearsed enough times that they came out smooth. Distribution timelines. Projected margins. The kind of story a man tells when he needs someone else's money more than he's willing to admit. Marcus listened without much expression. The kind of quiet that isn't rudeness so much as a man doing math in his head while someone else talks. When the entrees came, he finally asked the question I'd been waiting for all night. Whether the alcohol content certification had cleared state review yet, because Boone Capital wouldn't move $1 into distribution without it. Cole's answer wandered, vague in the way rehearsed answers get when the real one isn't ready. And I watched him reach for his water glass to buy himself a second he didn't need. Marcus pressed once more. Direct this time, asking who at the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control had signed off. That was the moment Cole's English started failing him. Not because he didn't know it, but because some men only feel safe saying certain things in a language they think buys them privacy. He leaned toward Marcus and switched to Spanish, his voice dropping into something low and easy, like he was letting Marcus in on a joke between the two of them. Don't worry about her name being anywhere near this, he said. The paperwork's already handled quiet. And whatever happens with this deal, win or lose, I'm not the one who ends up losing anything. I kept my fork resting against the edge of my plate. Didn't blink. Didn't give him the reaction 17 years of marriage had trained him to expect. Marcus set his glass down slower than he'd picked it up and asked in English, plainly, whether Cole was telling him the certification hadn't actually cleared. Cole waved it off, called it a formality, said the paperwork would catch up once the funding landed. And Marcus's jaw tightened in a way that told me he understood exactly what kind of promise he'd just been offered. I smiled the smile I'd used at 100 dinners just like it, set my glass down, and told them both I needed a minute in the ladies' room. Cole barely looked up, already circling back to his pitch. Already certain the woman walking away from that table hadn't understood a single word he'd said. I locked the stall door behind me and pulled out my phone before the tears even had a chance to consider showing up. Because what I felt standing there wasn't grief. It was clarity. The kind that arrives cold and immediate once you stop, hoping you misheard something. I scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in years and called Vanessa Boone. The one person who could end this deal before Cole ever got the chance to sign it. She picked up on the second ring, and I kept my voice low and even against the marble wall behind me, telling her I was having dinner with her brother and my husband had just told him my name wasn't going to be anywhere near this deal because the paperwork was already handled. Vanessa went quiet for a second, then asked me carefully whether Marcus had agreed to anything. I told her no, that he'd pushed back the moment Cole said it, but that Cole had followed it with something else. A line about not losing anything, no matter how the deal went. That part landed harder with her than the first, and I could hear her sit up straighter through the phone, the kind of stillness people go quiet with when they realize a casual sentence just handed them a warning. She told me not to confront him, not to warn him, just to go back out there and keep the call connected in my pocket while she figured out what she was dealing with. I straightened my dress in the mirror, checked my face for anything that might give me away, and told myself the version of me walking back into that dining room needed to look exactly like the one who'd left it. Cole barely glanced up when I sat back down, already circling back into his pitch. Already certain the woman across from him hadn't understood a single word that mattered. That night, once Cole's breathing had settled into the rhythm of a man who thinks the hard part of the evening is already behind him, I sat on the edge of the bathtub with my phone and pulled up my credit report. The blue light, the only thing cutting through the dark. 3 loans stared back at me, all of them tied to distillery expansion. All of them listing me as guarantor. None of them carrying a signature I remembered giving. I sat there a long moment just looking at my own name attached to debt I'd never agreed to, understanding for the first time how literally Cole had meant it when he told Marcus the paperwork was already handled. I called Denise Larkin first thing the next morning, before Cole was even out of the shower, and drove straight to her office with the printouts folded into my bag. She laid the loan signatures next to a refinance form we'd filed together 3 years earlier. And the match was almost exact. Close enough to fool a bank teller. Not close enough to fool someone who actually remembered signing her own name. Denise didn't say much while she worked, just kept turning pages, until she pulled up something else entirely. A certification file from the Kentucky Department of Alcoholic Beverage Control with 2 different alcohol content readings for the same batch number. One reading was clean enough to ship. The other wasn't. Denise looked at me and asked whether I'd known Cole had access to state inspection paperwork before it filed. And I told her I hadn't known any of this. Not the loans. Not the readings. Not the version of my own signature sitting in a stranger's file cabinet. Sitting there across from her, I understood that Cole's sentence at dinner hadn't been a threat about the deal falling apart. It had been a confession, delivered in a language he thought would keep it safe forever. Denise kept digging after the certification file, pulling every account linked to my name through the bank's shared portal. And that's when she found a life insurance policy I'd never applied for, opened 4 months earlier, listing me as the insured and Cole as the sole beneficiary. She turned her laptop toward me without saying much, just pointed at the date. The same month, the first of those forged loans had gone through. I stared at the number attached to the policy and felt something colder than anger settle into my chest. A kind of stillness I hadn't expected. Denise was careful not to let me run too far with it, reminding me plenty of husbands take out policies on their wives without anything sinister behind it. That a policy alone proved nothing on its own. But sitting there next to the loan documents and the falsified certification file, it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a pattern. One where every risk in this marriage had quietly been routed onto my name, while every reward stayed close to his. I thought about the timeline without meaning to. The loans. The policy. The dinner with Marcus. All of it stacking into the same few months, like someone had been building toward something. I didn't say any of that out loud to Denise. Not yet. Because some thoughts need a little more evidence before you let yourself believe them. What I did know, sitting in that office with 3 different documents spread across the table, was that Cole's sentence about not losing anything no matter how the deal went had never been about the distillery at all. Denise found Marissa Odom's name buried in an old personnel file, the quality manager who'd signed off on batch certifications until she vanished from the paperwork 8 months back. And when I finally reached her, she didn't want to talk at all. She'd taken a severance payout and a non-disclosure agreement, and she told me flatly that she'd built a career she wasn't willing to lose over someone else's marriage. I told her Cole had used my name to guarantee the same expansion her falsified readings were supposed to fund, and the line went quiet long enough that I thought she'd hung up. "Give me an hour," she said, and hung up for real. What she brought to Denise's office an hour later was worse than either of us expected. Emails where Cole told her plainly to adjust the readings before the batch shipped, and a recording from a meeting where he threatened to expose a minor bookkeeping error from her own file if she didn't cooperate. She'd kept copies of everything the day she left. Not because she planned to use them, just because some part of her knew she might need proof one day that she'd said no. Pause 5S. Denise laid it all out on the table and told me we had enough to move. But she wanted one more thing. Cole saying it himself. On the record. In his own voice. I texted him that night saying I was ready to sign whatever he needed. That I just wanted to understand how I'd be protected if the deal fell apart. And he answered within minutes. Already relieved. Already certain he'd won me back. Denise booked a conference room at her firm under a consulting name he wouldn't recognize, with a recording notice posted clearly by the door. And I walked in playing every part of the woman he expected to find there. I brought up the house, brought up how frightened I was of starting over, and Cole softened into the tone he always used when he thought he had the upper hand, telling me I didn't understand business, that I just needed to trust him. I asked him straight out why my name was on the loans, and he said banks trusted a family business more, called it a formality, said I always signed whatever he handed me anyway. So if this falls apart, I'm the one responsible. I said, and he almost laughed, told me it wouldn't fall apart as long as I did my part and stopped asking questions I didn't need answers to. I asked what happened if the certification never actually cleared. And that was the moment he said it plain as anything, that the report only needed to exist long enough for the funding to clear, and after that, nobody would care which version was real. The signing ceremony never happened. What Cole walked into instead was a conference room at Boone Capital with Marcus, the fund's attorney, and a representative from the bank already seated, and no idea yet that Vanessa had turned his celebration into a hearing. He opened with the same pitch he'd rehearsed for weeks. Growth projections. Distribution timelines. Talk of building something that would outlast both of us. And for a moment I almost believed he still thought he was winning. Vanessa asked him directly whether the alcohol content certification submitted to the state matched the one on file with his own quality team. And Cole said it did. Without hesitating. Without knowing Marissa was sitting in the next room. That was my cue to walk in. I didn't raise my voice or accuse him of anything. I told the room plainly that I'd never signed a single loan guarantee tied to the expansion. And Cole's composure held for maybe 5 seconds, before it started to crack. He tried calling it a misunderstanding, tried saying I was upset over something personal. And that was when Marissa walked in behind me and confirmed every email, every threat, every altered reading, in a voice steadier than his had ever been in that room. Denise played the recording last, Cole's own voice filling the room, saying the certification only needed to exist long enough for the funding to clear. Marcus stood and told the room he'd never approved anything involving me as part of any deal. And Vanessa announced Boone Capital was withdrawing entirely and forwarding every document to the state. Cole was indicted on charges of financial forgery weeks later, and the distillery he'd built his whole identity around was placed under receivership before the case ever reached trial. The divorce moved slower than I expected, but the fraud on the record made the split clean in a way I hadn't dared hope for. And I walked away without $1 of his debt attached to my name. I sold the house, moved into something smaller that felt entirely mine, and rebuilt my credit one account at a time. Vanessa offered me a consulting role months later, negotiating terms for the fund's new partnerships, and I said yes without needing a single night to think it over. I think about that dinner sometimes. The chandelier, the wine, the sentence he thought I'd never understand. And I don't feel anger anymore when I do. I feel like a woman who finally stopped waiting for someone else's permission to hear her own life clearly. If you've ever had to relearn the sound of your own voice after years of staying quiet, I hope you know it comes